Imagine messing with a Ouija board just for fun, not believing in ghosts. But what if it starts spelling out names it shouldn't know? What if a dead friend's parents are suddenly brought up, things start moving on their own, and the cat... Well, the cat starts seeing something none of you can? Now imagine the place you thought was haunted. It's real, and it's not the only thing that's been watching. This is the night I realized the supernatural was no joke. Stay tuned to find out what happened when we pushed too far and what we really uncovered. But before we start, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you'll never miss a spine-tingling episode. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like, comment, and share the video. And if you want even more, stay connected with us on our social media platforms for more creepy content. Thank you all for being part of this journey with me. And now let's dive into the darkness together. Back in the mid-90s, when I was still trying to figure things out, life took a dark turn after my parents passed away. I felt lost, but I had an old friend from high school, Jake, who was always around to hang out. Jake had a girlfriend named Sarah, and she was deep into things like witchcraft, the occult, and all that strange stuff. They lived in a basement apartment with two other girls, one of whom, Leah, once told me the place was haunted by a ghost called Phil. Apparently Phil couldn't really harm anyone, but the idea of a ghost being around intrigued me. At that point, I was a little adventurous, so Jake and I decided to grab a Ouija board. We figured it would be a fun way to mess around with the supernatural. We didn't take it seriously, but Sarah was all in, and we were waiting for her to come home from work before we started the session. I brought my buddy Mark along. He'd been friends with me since childhood, but he didn't know Sarah all that well. So the plan was to mess around with the Ouija and see what happened. While we waited, Jake and I ran out to grab some beers, and when we returned, Mark was clearly shaken. He downed a beer in one gulp and said he was leaving. When I asked him what happened, he said that he and Sarah had tried the Ouija board while we were gone, and Mark was convinced she was moving the planchette. However, when he asked the board for the names of his parents, the Ouija board somehow spelled them out. The thing was, Mark's parents had passed away years before, and no one besides Mark knew their names. Sarah definitely didn't. This really freaked him out, and he left in a hurry. Jake and I, feeling daring, decided to mess with the Ouija board again. This time, Phil, the ghost, showed up. We joked around, accusing each other of moving the planchette. Eventually, we got bored and stopped using the board. I left it behind at Jake's place and went home. The next evening, I returned to Jake's, and Sarah, along with the other girls, were out. Jake and I decided to have a quiet night with some beer and a movie. Our friend Jay, a laid-back guy with red hair, came by, and we decided to have another go at the Ouija board. As soon as we started, Phil made an appearance again, but this time the board spelled out, "Watch the cat." Sarah's cat, which had been asleep on the rug, suddenly woke up and started hissing at something we couldn't see. The cat darted around like it was being chased, then disappeared into one of the bedrooms. Jay, who had been calm up until then, turned ghostly pale and bolted for the front door. He almost knocked Jake over as he ran outside, and when we caught up with him, he refused to come back inside. He was so rattled that we spent the rest of the evening sitting outside talking until it got late. A few days later, I went back to Jake's, and this time, Jay came along again. He was still shaken up from what had happened before, but we decided to try the Ouija again. This time, the spirit seemed angrier. The board spelled out some threatening messages, saying it was going to get us. We laughed it off and made jokes about it, not really taking it seriously. But by the time everyone had gone to bed, I had fallen asleep in the spare bed in Jake and Sarah's room. That night, I had the most bizarre dream. The streetlights outside the window kept flickering on and off, and something outside was whispering my name. I woke up in the morning and mentioned it to Jake over breakfast, brushing it off as just a weird dream. But to my surprise, Jake looked pretty shaken as well. He told me that he'd had the same dream, except for the fact that in his dream, the lights inside the house were flickering, and something in the hallway was calling his name. I laughed it off, thinking Jake was just playing a prank, but I wasn't sure. That night, we decided to test things once and for all. We drove out to a secluded old cemetery. It was surrounded by woods, and there was a small church nearby. It was dark, and we were in the middle of nowhere. We figured that if ghosts were real, this would be the place to find one. We set up the Ouija board in front of one of the tombstones. Jake lit candles, and the rest of us wandered around the cemetery. We hadn't been watching Jake for long, but suddenly he screamed, "Let's get the hell out of here," and started running toward the car. He was freaking out, urging us to hurry up. We all followed him, and once we were in the car, Jake kept telling Bob, who was driving, to floor it. Bob, who was also a little scared, didn't need much convincing. As we drove away, I asked Jake what had happened. He wouldn't say, just kept telling me he didn't want to talk about it. Over the years, I've asked Jake about that night, but he's never told me. I can't say for sure what happened, but I know Jake wasn't the type to scare easily, and he definitely seemed terrified that night. Maybe it was all a prank, but I'll never know for sure. I eventually took the Ouija board home with me since it was mine, but that night I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, and I'm not sure I ever felt completely safe again. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, something happened that stayed with me for my entire life. It started off as small, odd occurrences, things I didn't understand at the time. My family would hear strange noises in the house. Things would move when no one was around, and there was this general feeling of unease that we couldn't explain. I remember being terrified at night, but I thought it was just my imagination running wild. But as these events continued, my parents grew more concerned. At first, they couldn't put their finger on what was causing the strange happenings. They checked the house thoroughly, tried to explain it all away with logical reasoning, but nothing seemed to make sense. It wasn't until one afternoon that everything changed. My parents were cleaning out the garage when they came across something that would ultimately lead to a chain of events I can never forget. An old Ouija board. It had been left behind by the previous owner, an elderly woman who had lived in the house before we moved in. My parents, being devout Christians, were immediately unsettled. They knew the reputation of these boards and had heard enough stories about people dabbling with them, so they wasted no time. They decided to destroy it, hoping that would stop whatever it was that was haunting us. They took the board out to the backyard, put it in the burn barrel, and set it on fire, determined to rid our home of whatever spirit had taken hold. I don't remember much about the days before the fire, but the events that happened when my dad lit the board on fire are forever etched in my mind. I can still hear the sharp crackle of the flames and the smell of the burning wood, but what followed was something I can't explain. As the fire grew, something incredibly unsettling happened. Out of nowhere, we heard a piercing, blood-curdling scream coming from the flames. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a scream that seemed to echo in my bones. I remember peeking into the flames, almost instinctively, and seeing something I'll never forget, a dark, shadowy figure, the silhouette of a man, but with no face. It was like he was a shadow, a figure without any defining features. My heart stopped. I froze, unable to look away, the sight burning into my mind. It wasn't just the image of this faceless figure that terrified me, but the overwhelming sense of wrongness it radiated. My dad, who had been standing next to me, didn't seem surprised at all. He had seen something similar before, or so he said. In fact, he told me later that he'd heard rumors from the locals about strange happenings around the house, things people had experienced that no one could explain. But this was different. Even he seemed shaken by what we'd just witnessed. After a few moments of standing in silence, we went inside. But I could tell my dad was just as disturbed by what had happened as I was. Over the years, we tried to move on. My parents thought that by destroying the Ouija board, we'd rid ourselves of whatever had been lurking in our home. But it didn't work. The strange occurrences didn't stop. The noises got louder. Objects still moved on their own. And sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night with the distinct feeling that something was watching me. That constant sense of dread never fully went away. When I got older, I thought I might be imagining things, that it was all in my head. But then, the feeling of being watched would return, as would the noises, creaks and groans from the empty corners of the house. Every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of shadowy figures in my peripheral vision. It was as if this entity, whatever it was, refused to leave us alone. Even my parents, who were usually so steadfast in their faith, couldn't deny that something was still attached to our family. By the time I left for college, I had convinced myself that maybe I was just afraid of the unknown. I distanced myself from everything to do with the house and my parents' religion. But even now, years later, I feel like this presence is still with me. I've tried to move on, but the sense of fear and anxiety remains, and the memories of that night by the burn barrel are still haunting. I haven't lived with my parents for years, but we haven't talked much since I left their faith behind. Still, I know they've experienced the same things I have. Sometimes when I visit, I'll notice the strange atmosphere return, like the house is still holding on to whatever it is that came through that Ouija board. I've done a lot of research over the years, trying to find any logical explanation for the things we've experienced, but I haven't found anything that matches. People tell me I'm imagining things, that it's all superstition or fear. But deep down, I know what I saw, what I felt, and it's not just the terror of a child. It's a deep, instinctual knowing that something was, and maybe still is, there with us. To this day, I still don't know what that entity was or why it attached itself to our family. It's been nearly 2 decades since that night by the burn barrel, but the dread hasn't faded. I'm not sure how to get rid of it, or if it can even be gotten rid of at all. But I'm still searching for answers. If anyone has any advice or suggestions on how to sever whatever connection exists with this entity, I'd appreciate it more than I can express. It's been a long, difficult journey, but I'm not giving up. I want my family and myself to be free of whatever this is. I'd never had any interest in using a Ouija board. That all changed in my mid-20s though, when my friend Kyle invited me to join him and some girls on an eerie adventure. One of the girls, Lisa, was really into exploring abandoned places and had a fascination with the paranormal. She mentioned this old, supposedly haunted house about 30 minutes away from us. Kyle, trying to entice me, promised the other girl, Julia, was cute, so I figured, why not? I didn't have anything better to do that night. Around 11 p.m., Kyle picked me up, and we headed to pick up the girls. I'd met Lisa before, but this was the first time I was meeting Julia, who had short, bright red hair, a nose ring, and a sleeve tattoo on her right arm. Lisa was excited to show us this house, saying she'd been there before and claimed it had high activity, a term that was new to me at the time. I smiled to myself, thinking she was probably just into spooky stuff, but I didn't really buy into all of it. Lisa brought a large bag with her, and during the drive, I asked what was inside. She pulled out a Ouija board box, along with a couple of candles. Kyle laughed and said that this was going to be the big surprise for the night. Apparently, Lisa's plan was to use the Ouija board inside the haunted house. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but I was there for the experience, so I didn't complain. When we got closer to the house, Lisa directed Kyle to park down a dark, deserted street with no streetlights. One side of the road had an open field, while the other was lined with thick woods. The house's driveway was gated off, so we had to walk through the woods to get to the backyard. Lisa led us to a back window she had climbed through the last time, so we helped the girls in first, then climbed in ourselves. The house was old, with everything still inside, but it was completely decayed, like it hadn't been lived in for decades. I'm not easily spooked, but even I'll admit that the atmosphere in there at night was unnerving. The house was eerily silent, aside from our footsteps creaking on the old floors. I couldn't help but wonder about the history of the place, especially after seeing portraits on the walls from the 1950s. It made me think about who had lived here, what had happened to them. Most likely, the owners had passed away, and there was no family left to take care of the house. Lisa set up the Ouija board on the floor and lit a couple of candles around it. She seemed really into this whole thing, so she took charge of the session, asking the usual questions. Is anyone here? Can anyone hear us? At first, the planchette didn't move at all, and I could see Kyle rolling his eyes. But then, after a few moments, the planchette moved and spelled out, "Hello." I looked at Kyle, who gave me a skeptical glance. But Lisa and Julia were serious. They told us to stop laughing, and out of respect I tried to be more serious, although I still wasn't convinced. Lisa asked the spirit's name, and the planchette slowly spelled out Gregory. Then she asked how long Gregory had been dead, and it moved to spell 30 years. I still wasn't buying any of it. I was sure Lisa or Julia were just pushing the planchette to mess with us. The whole time, I felt like it was just a prank. We continued on with the session for a while until a loud thump from upstairs suddenly echoed through the house. All of us jumped, and we immediately let go of the planchette. "Did someone make that noise?" Kyle asked, but Lisa insisted it was Gregory. At this point, Kyle and I were both convinced that the girls were pranking us and had someone upstairs making the noise. We heard the distinct sound of footsteps from above. There was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was walking upstairs. Kyle and I decided we needed to check it out. The girls urged us not to go up there, but we figured we'd catch whoever was trying to scare us. We climbed the creaky staircase, moving slowly and quietly, and entered the first open door we found. It was a bedroom, the furniture in complete disrepair. But what caught my attention was the door at the far end of the room. It was slightly ajar, and Kyle and I whispered to each other that we thought we heard something inside the closet. I motioned for him to be quiet as we listened intently. Then, out of nowhere, we both heard a deep, clear exhale from behind the door. In an instant, we bolted out of the room, rushing back downstairs. We expected to find Lisa and Julia still in the living room, but when we got down, everything was different. The candles were gone, the Ouija board was gone, and the house was completely silent. The girls were nowhere to be found. We quickly climbed back out the window and ran to the car. Kyle tried calling Lisa multiple times, but her phone kept going straight to voicemail. It was clear she had blocked him. We drove off, completely confused, and neither of us ever heard from her again. Kyle hadn't even known where she lived. We came up with our own wild theories. Maybe the girls were trying to trap us, and the footsteps upstairs were from someone they knew who was hiding up there. Or maybe they never left the house, and were still hiding inside. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it felt like something supernatural had been going on that night. Whatever happened in that house, I'm still not sure, but it's an experience I'll never forget. If you've experienced a terrifying event or have a horror story to tell, we at AG Horrors want to hear from you. Share your experiences with us on Reddit, and let's uncover the mysteries hiding in the shadows together. And if you want to support the channel and help us bring even more terrifying content, consider checking out our support options on Patreon or Ko-fi. Your support means the world to us. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more spine-chilling stories like this one. And now, stay tuned for the next horror episode.